recording there, boss. Thanks.
Gotcha.
Well, hello, pretty people. How are you all doing? Thanks for coming back. This is the last class. Just a reminder, we'll be recording this class. So if you, for some reason, don't want to have your image recorded, please turn off your camera. And I know folks who are here now who don't want to be called on, so I won't. But if there's anyone who wants to remain, more anonymous, then go right ahead. Cool. Thanks for that too. The tunnel. I haven't seen the tunnel. All right, let's get at it. I want to get through a couple of things, and then I want to spend the rest of the time in breakout sessions. And I think we've got a small enough group that we could probably do just two breakout sessions, unless we get a crowd rushing in at the last minute during the first song here, storming the gates, giving themselves a miracle as they did in Grateful Dead days. All right. So we're going to start off going back to the front of the book. I realized during the first class that there was a better way to teach this. You probably realized that, those of you who were in the first class. And I felt, especially the theology chapter, in many ways, was something to leave us with. And I was actually just sharing with Deborah Ann, like, why did they put theology first instead of last? Well, first, it's one of the first things you read. So not everybody makes it to the end of the book. And so we're going to look at those couple of things. I'll open it up to general questions about the class in general. And then I have 3 breakout questions for 3 breakout sessions. I can't imagine that we won't be done by 8:30. So let's get started so I can actually make that so, as they say. Here we go. And so the chapter, the book begins with a chapter on trends. And I think it's important to just spend a little bit of time with this chapter, because this is another part of Unitarian Universalist history that I cannot expect everyone to know. Those of you who've been around a long time will recognize some of these things, right? And we've talked about some trending things last week, some of the cultural misappropriation things, et cetera, and some of the other ways that our faith has changed over the years. So I'm just going to share some of this from the Trends book and the chapter of the book. And it starts around page 3 in the text. And page 3 has... So I'm just going to go through some of this stuff, and I'll share whenever I think I need to share the screen. I'm just going to share a few things that you're probably aware of, but there's a group called the Pew Research Center, which really spends a lot of time studying Americans' attitudes towards religions and other nonprofit institutions. And what they've discovered, is over the last 40 years, that fewer people are participating in religious communities in general. What they also found is that somewhere around the year 2000, people began to leave mainline Protestant churches in larger numbers than they were leaving other religious systems. Catholicism has actually grown somewhat, and some sort of apostolic, super right-wing evangelical churches and religions in mostly Hispanic communities have grown in number, but like Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Methodist, Lutheran, they're what are known as the mainline churches in American denominationalism, have declined, and some of them significantly. And those trends can be they believe attributed to a couple of simple things. You may recall around the early 2000s, there was a big to-do about whether or not they should ordain a gay bishop in the Episcopal denomination. And most Episcopals were in favor of it, but the denomination and the hierarchy wasn't, and it created a great schism. Many other of the mainline congregations, denominations, Presbyterians, Lutherans, and others had a similar struggle. And what happened is people left those churches in droves. Presbyterianism alone has lost more than 26% of its membership since 2001. 26%. And that's the latest we have, evidence for. That's from just a couple of years ago still. So they may have lost even more. And the conclusion I think to make is when denominations are not out in front of the changing understanding of liberty and who should be included in the human family, people will leave. And not just the existing people will leave, but young folks who are coming in who expect, their religious leaders to be enlightened and to see what is happening in our understanding of human decency and dignity. When young folks see that we're not preaching freedom and truth and liberation, they're not going to come back. Now, Unitarian Universalism in that time, interestingly, our membership has stayed almost the same in pure numbers. There may have been a dip, there may have not, but any dip we had was very insignificant, a matter of a percentage point or two. We have not kept pace with the rise of the American population. And so again, I think some of the people who study these things, as well as my own observation, is because we have been willing to proclaim that LGBTQ folks are fully human and should not be derided, and they should be put into positions of religious leadership. And they are seeing that we are willing to at least talk the talk. And here we're talking about the eighth principle, trying to make sure we walk the walk of dismantling white supremacy. So in a very real sense, when you're not on the leading edge of societal understanding of how we should be improving who is a full member of the human family, it does a whole lot of things, but it also makes your church eventually decline, and the evidence of the last 20 years significantly so. The other thing that's kind of true is that even though our total numbers are about where they were 20 years ago, our smaller congregations have gotten smaller and our larger congregations have gotten larger. Congregations our size keep hovering about the same size, which means what we understand in congregational studies, health attracts health and vitality, meaning when a congregation is vibrant and living into its mission and has clear boundaries and operates with a sense of covenant and purpose, it's attractive to people and people stay or people join. And you heard me share, some of the unfortunate tales of some of our very, very small congregations, especially some of those in New England with large endowments, quote unquote, sitting on the franchise, with maybe 3 people on a Sunday morning and 12 people total in membership. They're the churches that there's more and more of those sort of small, marginal churches, congregations left in our movement. So as institutional religion continues to decline, more people who enter our doors, they are not running away from another religious system. There was a time in Unitarian Universalism, and I'm sure some of the folks who've been members for a longer time can testify to this. Most of the people who were in our churches were people, who just felt like they didn't fit in their church of their youth. They could no longer, recite the Apostles' Creed. Catholicism, they didn't like the fact that women couldn't be priests. All these manner of things. They were what was called come outers. So we're coming out of other churches and into ours. And it was a huge source of growth for us in the 50s and 60s. But what's happened in the last 40 years is that fewer and fewer people are growing up with a religious church habit. I mean, that their parents didn't make them go to church. Yes, they may have gone to this church or that somewhat, but they don't have a strong identification with a religion that might have been the religion of their parents. So they come into they're known as the come-inners, if you want to, that's sort of the church speak for it. that they are looking for spiritual nurture, and they have an idea what congregational life is like from TV, from their friends, but they really don't know, and they don't come into our congregations like, I don't want to hear about the Bible. Please don't talk to me about Jesus. I don't want to sing that old hymn because we sang that in my Presbyterian church growing up. I'm sure some of you who've been around for a while have heard some of these things, in other from other members over the years. But that's not the new people who come in. They don't say that to us as religious leaders. They come in, they expect Anya and I to know the Bible. They expect Anya and I to talk about Jesus. They expect us to have something that looks like what they think, a congregational life should be on Sunday morning. So those are broad trends, but they are trends that have been documented now for more than a couple of decades. So that's a trend. And so a couple more of these little things to notice. Other trends is that the demographics of our nation, as it changes and as we are growing towards being a majority minority culture, we continue to see the explosion of our population that is non-white. So California, which has 1/8 of America's population, Hawaii, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, white people are already not the majority. The Bureau of Census shows that non-Hispanic white folks will be a minority by roughly the year 2044. And what does this mean? So it means a growing number of people marry outside their racial group. So that is increasing the number of multiracial Americans. It means that a growing number of people everywhere that they are, school, perhaps church, though church is often one of the most segregated places in people's lives. School, their workplace, the coffee shop, the library, everywhere they go is multiracial and multicultural for many, many more Americans, younger Americans, way more so. And newer generations really feel this. And newer, how kids are, kids, teenagers, they're not very patient when adults don't get it. So when younger people come into our congregations and we're not as woke as they think we should be, they're not very patient with that. They want to know, because they're taught this. They live this every day. All of their friends are multicolored. All their friends are dating people of other races. And so they don't have much patience with any institution that's wants to hem and haw and be overly cautious and gradual about trying to embrace this coming diversity that is going to be the new America. And it really is the new America in many places today. Where I used to live in Northern Virginia, one of the Prince William County, Virginia, was known as the swing county of America. As Prince William County, Virginia went, the presidential election went in about 4 or 5 consecutive elections. And that gave us a lot of opportunity in community organizing, because the politicians always paid attention to what was happening there. And so, and one of the things that really created a lot of tension in that county was it quickly became a county where white folks were the minority over a period of 6 years. And so this is part of some of the unfortunate reactionary, right-wing politics that we see, because folks don't know how to respond to that. And they're not being led well by the people they're willing to call leaders and how to respond to that.
Excuse me, Reverend Scott, Sue has a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Sue, sorry.
You're muted, Sue.
It just seems like, I absolutely agree if you're speaking about the coasts, but I'm not, are you, is that true for the flyover states as well?
Well, okay, so it's true for the coasts, and it's true for the large metropolitan areas. For instance, today, Houston, Texas is the most diverse city in the United States. Okay, so the large metropolitan areas everywhere, Jackson, Mississippi, the large metropolitan urban areas are this way now. And the South is going to change so much faster than any of us realize. I mean, we saw this a little bit in the election with Georgia, but North Carolina, Texas. I mean, if this complete mishandling of the electrical grid doesn't push Texas a couple more points to being blue, I don't know what can. I mean, this was all about government deregulation, right? I mean, as someone who used to build power plants, it's not that hard to put insulation on pipes coming out of the ground that feed your power plant. I'm just going to put that out there, okay? And so what they were thinking, they were told a decade ago. So these are the changes that are coming. And people and young people, people who are 30 years old today, they've lived through school shootings. They've lived through, now 2 economic crises, the one of 08, 09, and the one we're in now. And they don't hate the idea that the government should maybe help people when we have a century, long crisis, a once in a century crisis. And so all of this is going to change so fast, I feel. There will be other things that's going to complicate it all, but younger people don't have a lot of, they don't trust institutions because they haven't always been led well, right, in their lifetimes. They're not sure they trust government because of the 08, 09 economic crisis, or because of how COVID was handled. So I'm sure they're very much watching the current administration to see if it walks its talk. So all these things are this is the world we're in. And so just a couple more of these things about trends, and I'll stop for a couple more questions. And so, let's see. So one of the things that some of the vestiges in Unitarian Universalism related to the way we were and the way we assumed we were for a little bit too long is that we haven't been investing in theological resources that help us have a more common vocabulary of faith. We also have got to find other economic models. You might have heard me talk a little bit about it in the service on Sunday. Can we find some external income streams? Our hope is some of the improvements we're doing with the live streaming technology installations, once we reopen, we'll be able to bring a little more money in from pockets that are not ours, right? We had an emphasis on hyper individualism. I've talked about this more, in some of the other classes, that we have a culture of mistrust of institutions and often of our own institution. So we've made an idol of the individual. And this is an American cultural thing, and it is a Unitarian thing, because we come from this way of understanding faith in the 20th century and late 19th century that the individual is exalted and that the individual almost is made an idol of, and almost this notion that all opinions are valid, we all have opinions, but they're not all equally applicable in every situation. And so how do we honor the individual while also having some ability to have collective effort and a communal sense about what we're doing in our mission? And add to that, just the entrenched dominant culture resistance to have a healthy way of dealing with conflict. One of the things I think that's, David Jones, board member last night, Sue, you were there, brought up the reading from Reverend Dr. King that talked about beloved community, and he asked a question about it. And one of the things that I keep thinking about is, in a world that actually honors peace and honors what everybody can bring to the table, when we're being honest and reasonable with one another, there's actually going to be more conflict. Because if the people who are normally silenced or not even let into the room are asked to speak, they're going to share their issues and, the damage that they've suffered. So we've got to have a healthy way to process that conflict so it doesn't become violence, so it doesn't become shaming or silencing, so it doesn't become warfare. But we don't have a good way of dealing with conflict as a culture. I think our congregation deals with conflict reasonably well. I think that's because our leadership is good. I think it's because Reverend Anya and I have had a lot of training in how to deal with conflict. But so all these things have made it difficult for us to be as dynamic as we could be. So that's part of this trends chapter that they're speaking about. The other things that we're noticing is because of the newer generations, a lot of people suggest that, the latest generation of Americans, won't have it quite as easy to make as much money and amass as much wealth as their parents. I'm not sure that's true, but that's what we hear and that's what they hear. And so it makes them resistant to investment in institutions, whether they have the money or they can never get the money. That's the story they're being told. And I don't know enough about economics to know if that's true or not, but that's seems to be what folks are suggesting is a trend. And so that does inhibit our ability to invest in younger people and newer ways of doing things. And as you may have noticed in the book, one of the things that was very difficult for folks to, confront is that we've defunded our youth and young adult programs. And that comes from primarily, we have not managed finances well at the Unitarian Universalist Association since the 1960s, frankly. You may or may not know this. Who knows how the UUA gets most of its funding? How does the Unitarian Universalist Association get most of its funding? Yes, Sue.
I believe, well, I know it is funded through the member congregations based on a percentage of, it used to be the actual number of people in the congregation, and now it's based on a percentage of the budget.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if that's the majority of their money.
So there are two main streams of funding for Unitarian Universalism. Congregations and other organizations who are members fund it. We fund it. Roughly 5.25% of our operating budget goes as dues to the Unitarian Universalist Association. It used to be, as Sue said, a head tax, which was a really dumb way to assess dues because it put negative pressure on congregations, encouraging them to not grow. I actually had people fight in it during a membership meeting once because they didn't want to declare someone a member because they didn't think they had pledged enough and we're going to have to pay dues for this person. And I stopped the meeting right there and I called the UUA the next day and said, can we change this? And it happened to be, they were already changing that. And it was, they had started the pilot program of doing a percentage of operating budget. That was 2010. And I asked them if we could do that, just because I had a conflict I had to resolve in the congregation. Imagine that you're on a membership committee meeting and someone's telling you, you have to declare someone not a member because we have to pay dues for them. What a dumb way to do things. Anyway, so sorry if I'm so open about things that I don't like, but I'd rather be honest. You can push back on me if you like, I can take it. The other main source of our funding comes from what's known as the VEACH program. This is a very interesting story. And if it wasn't for this woman, she was a widow of a very rich man who had mineral rights around the world. And she lived in a very lavish place on Long Island, the home now of the Shelter Rock congregation. And the minister there, she was ill and in the hospital, and she didn't have a pastor. So she simply called this pastor up, and he showed up at the hospital. He didn't know who she was. And he, walked with her until she died. and she left the house and grounds. If you've ever been there, it looks like UU Disney World, I call it, because there's like all these buildings and there's all this land, and all these mineral rights. And these mineral rights are going to keep giving us money for a very long time. And you know, they are controversial for some people because they include uranium and petroleum. But if it wasn't for the Veach Fund, we would not be able to do General Assembly or most of our programming. It would basically, our dues basically just pay for UUA staff and headquarters. So that's where we are. And they didn't come about until the late 70s, early 80s. So I know the current administration, Susan Frederick Graith, you know, thank God, you know, she's on this. She is doing her best to come up with a financially sustainable model for us to do our programming, including General Assembly. So these are the trends, and you know, and I just think it's important to share that. I may not have gotten all of this exactly right, but I'm pretty sure it's close. I mean, you know, I've been involved in this a long time, and I know Ned White, the former director of Veach, and I'm pretty sure I know all those details. So any questions or observations about all that? All right.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Good, Norma.
First two?
Norma, you go ahead.
Okay, so my understanding of the trends in our congregation is that there is a lifespan with regard to membership. Like, do you know what the trends are now compared to, you know, like maybe the 90s, or is the current iteration of the church holding on to more people at the UUCM? What my understanding is that it used to be people would come to either fleeing the Catholic Church or the Jewish religion, do what they needed to do to give their kids a Sunday morning experience. And then when the kids weren't interested anymore, they stopped coming because I guess there just wasn't that stickiness. And I'm just wondering if that's improving or not improving.
So I haven't seen the latest data on that. What I do know is that the last studies that I saw concluded somewhere around 2015 suggested that the 10 years before that, we were doing a better job at retaining members, including parents, after their kids finished religious education. And we were doing a better job of retaining young people after they went to college and, you know, began to settle down for their lives, whatever they were, whether they had children or not. These studies are done all the time. I guess there'll be something coming out soon. Of course, COVID's going to be, how do you study a trend with something like this in the middle? But what I can say about that is, you know, at least we've been trying. So in the 70s, the religious education materials were so, I'll just use the term hippy dippy. I don't know how else to say it. That, you know, their approach to religious education was, there's a whole world of spiritual expression and encounter, and you should go explore all those. We'll help you do that here. That's kind of how some of the cultural misappropriation came in, because they were asking teachers to try and provide students with a mock, you know, Buddhist experience or whatever. But they weren't focused as a mission on growing and retaining Unitarian Universalists. They thought that that was proselytizing. We'll leave that to the evangelicals. Well, you know, we're not going to have any lifelong UUs if we don't start telling people that this is a place that they should be a member of for life. And that's certainly a commitment that Reverend Anya and I have, and the staff and leadership here have. I mean, you know, we have different levels of wanting to be evangelists for Unitarian Universalism, but I think we're pretty clear in our programming that we're trying to grow lifelong UUs. And that actually was not a major focus of our religious education programming in the 70s and 80s. In fact, when they started to have they actually had to call it a UU identity curriculum, and some congregations refused to use it in the mid 80s. You know, we're just being like the right wing. You know, it's just institutionally unwise. Anyway, so yeah, so I'm not sure I answered all of your question, but I do know that what we're doing today, I can't imagine one of my colleagues, especially not the religious education colleagues, who aren't trying to grow lifelong Unitarian Universalists. There might be better ways we can do it, but that is at least a main part of our expressed mission, as it should be. Sue.
Oh, mine was a really stupid question.
Oh.
It was about the Widow Beach. Was Widow Beach actually not a UU herself? I just assumed that, you know, prior to her death.
I do not believe she was. The story I heard from Paul Johnson was that she had no religious. I mean, she declared herself to be one before she died, but she wasn't before she was hospitalized. I'm almost certain she wasn't. I can look into that, but my recollection of that, and I'll make a note to talk to Ned about that.
If that has not yet been studied, that would be an amazing project for some UU somebody, because I can't tell you how many times I've heard about these huge endowments or huge amounts of donations given to the UU congregation or the UU based from people who were not UUs themselves.
It's not uncommon for any religious institution. It actually isn't. Yeah.
When the congregation I used to belong to in Cherry Hill, you know, they just got this weird piece of mail one day, and it turns out that the neighbor next door, who was, you know, he just willed 17 acres of, you know, prime real estate to their congregation because, you know, he's next door, and he had stopped in once or twice and thought they were kind of cool, and
yeah.
You know, not a member, never UU, just kind of like 17 acres of prime real estate.
My home congregation, the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship at Harford County on Churchville Road in Churchville, Maryland, they were looking for land, and they were gifted land by an African-American man who remembered that when he went to Selma, he saw more Unitarians than anyone else. And when they were looking for land, and he found out it was the Unitarian Church, he wanted to give it to them, and they sort of made him take some money for it. I mean, they had a budget, right? You know, they didn't, you know, because he was still alive. It wasn't a bequest. And so and that's an amazing story there. And again, it just tells you the need for us to be out there and visible in our witness for our values. Boom. And to us, and that includes, you know, you hear me say this before, pastoral care is social justice too, right? You know, if we're not there to be with people when they're in crisis or scared or dying, you know, then who are we as well, right? And so so all those things are true. And I'll reach out to Ned White. He will love to talk to me at length. He tells longer stories than me, which I appreciate about him. And so I'll report back whatever I find out from him. He's now retired, but he's very hale and hearty. I'm sure he's doing well. All right, let's look a bit at the theology chapter. All right, and Norma Tassi put in the chat, I've heard the second biggest religion is no religion. It's actually the number one response for people under 35 is no religion in the Pew studies. Number one response is none. And so how do we attract the nuns? Can we attract the nuns? Because there are fewer and fewer people, you know, who are in religions that might be disaffected, right? You know, I believe we maintained our membership in the 2000s because people were leaving Presbyterianism, Episcopalianism, and Lutheranism, et cetera, because they refused to accept, you know, gay members and clergy. But, you know, that's about to change across the board, you know. And so, you know, so we've always got to be about something more than just that. We've got to be about that too. So that's the whole next piece, this theology piece. So I'm gonna walk us through a little bit of this theology section of the book, which is technically chapter 1. So I'll share this on the screen. Why not? So you can read along. I shouldn't assume you all like to hear. I like to read along too. And I'm reading this piece from Earl Holt. Such ambiguity and a concomitant tentativeness in articulating what we are about religiously is presently perhaps our greatest liability and the greatest obstacle to Unitarian Universalism achieving the fulfillment of its potential as an empowering and liberating faith for the 21st century. The fear that any such articulation somehow threatens the integrity or right of conscience of any individual is institutionally disabling and must be overcome by mutual trust and a sense of common purpose. The belief that we are joined together in religious association for more than merely instrumental reasons. All right. Reverend Earl Holt, longtime minister at King's Chapel, Boston. If you ever do the coming of age trip, that's one of the places we always try and get into. It's right off the Boston Common as you're heading down towards the banking district. It's called King's Chapel because it was originally Anglican. And to this day, it's both Anglican and Unitarian Universalist, which is kind of bizarre. And it's called King's because that's where the king was expected to worship if he came to the New World. Interesting background history. They still do the Lord's Prayer and communion. It's that kind of Unitarian Universalist congregation. And so he was there for a long time, 30 some years, I believe. Yeah. And so these kind of, so how do we listen to Holt's challenge to find a way to articulate our faith and not be so frightened that it will threaten our integrity or right of conscience? As James Luther Adams says, the faith of free persons must tangibly make them free in a community of human dignity and equal justice. And so how do we do this? I'm going to share a little bit here from Mary Byron. Let's see what I wanted to share from her. I'm consulting like 3 sources as I do this. I hope that's okay with you guys. All right. Now, I think I just want to go to some of these. I want to stick to the theology here. All right, so I'm going to read this paragraph and I'll pull it up on the screen again. Thank you for your patience. I'm looking for the one that begins freedom of belief. Next time. Oh yeah, this is Paul Razor. Before Sophia Bentoncourt. All right. Here we go. This is Paul Razor, one of our theologians, really sharp guy. I love his books. So here's what he says. Freedom of belief promotes diversity of thought and fuels the responsible search for truth and meaning that leads toward beloved community. This freedom encourages exploration and experimentation, lending creativity and innovation to our communities. Yet over the decades since the consolidation of Unitarians and Universalists, an overemphasis on individual exploration and experience as the primary, if not sole center of religious experience developed. And this centering of the individual decenters the communal as a locus of theological exploration. And one of the unintended consequences has been the atomized individualism of the search for truth and meaning without accountability to its impact on community. This is a correlation with the ways in which justice priorities and practices are lived in congregations. Justice-seeking practices of Unitarian Universalism are often not grounded on spiritual or ritual principles. Instead, justice-seeking takes the place of ritual and religious life. Justice practices cannot be used as surrogates for deepening our spiritual lives. Just want that to sink in. I'll leave it on the screen for a second. And I'd love to have your response to that.
Can I ask a question or make a
Yes.
response? So I remember when I was about 10 years into being a UU, Reverend Ortman made a distinction between those things that were religious in our congregation or our religion and those that were spiritual. And there seems to be a third leg of those that are not necessarily either religious or spiritual, but are certainly part of our 7 principles, which is the activism part and the society part. And I'm wondering, do you see those things as separate, all represented, or how should we think about those 3 areas?
And I invite anyone else to respond as well to Dan's question. Yeah, I think I'd love to see or listen to that sermon. There is a difference between, the sort of, often when I think of the religious piece, I think about our ritual and how, our practices and our customs and our history.
Yep.
And they're imbued with, hopefully, praise for and a chance to access the spiritual and a way to try and gather and use spiritual nurture. And I think what has been bubbling up and what I've begun to articulate in this way, and I don't know how many of my colleagues are saying it this way, and the Reverend Anya and I and a lot of our close friends see our faith this way. One of the things that seems to be most fulfilling in our activism, in how we walk our talk, is that it is grounded deeply in spiritual practice and ritual. So if you look at what sustained the civil rights movement of the mid 20th century, you really begin in many ways just before the Second World War. A. Philip Randolph, trying to do some work integrating different workspaces and other Black leaders. And then you get to the late 40s where, there are things like the first Freedom Ride was on a train. Reverend Ken Patton, a Unitarian minister, was on that train with a lot of Black activists. They were going to go all the way to Georgia, and they barely got out of Virginia. We're like, I think we made our point. We don't want to go to the Deep South. And then, then what happens, in the 50s, in Birmingham and Montgomery, all of that work was organized was attended by religious leadership, and so you'll see this at community organizing that's done through congregations. We're doing some of this work with Jersey Together to explore that. All of those functions begin and end with prayer. And of course, it's multi-faith. So, you never know what you're going to get. It depends on who's asked to do it. The organizing happens, in the congregation, we know that, the Montgomery bus boycott, there was a lot of training that happened in it. The church paid for folks to go to that training. There were 30 or 35,000 flyers that were already printed before Rosa Parks, after her training decided, that they all decided which day she was going to start the boycott, and they were ready to go. They had a plan. All this meaning that when we look back at it, it looks like, an event or two, but it was a way of being. It was a way of living that included always the touchstone and the rejuvenation of gathering again with the religious community and participating in its rituals. The singing and the praying and the preaching. That's why they all, in Selma, when they got hounded, they ran back to the church. And, they started singing songs and they started preaching. I mean, that's how they sustained the long haul of that work. And so I think that's what Razor's getting at. And so I think we just need to articulate that in a way that makes it clear that they're always partners. They're always dance partners. I never forget, I won't say what congregation it was. It definitely wasn't here, and it wasn't the congregation I served before here. But there was a rally for something, but it was starting with a prayer service. And a couple of folks from the congregation I was working with showed up with bullhorns and signs. I'm like, we need that on the street, but let's, these are the Episcopalians. They like things done a certain way. We're going to go in the way they would want us to go in and participate in their prayer service, and we can turn the bullhorn when we get back outside. And so that was an evidence that we need to be comfortable with more complexity, I think, in some ways, and that everything isn't always the same. And what's our touchstone? That's why I use the funny language, calling the congregation the mothership. We need a place to come back to get rejuvenated, right? So that's not particularly well formulated, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other responses to the Razor piece? Sure, Annalise.
I'm not sure if this is in response to the what you're asking, but I'm thinking about the I don't even know what I'm looking at now. Somewhere in this, I think in the theology section, we're talking about the overemphasis of individual exploration.
Mm-hmm.
And it prompted me to think about the coming of age
Mm-hmm.
process that my oldest is going through right now.
Mm-hmm.
And that having been one of the key things that attracted me to UU, like, wow, what an amazing thing. And I think, and I'm hearing this overemphasis on individual exploration, and it's that that program culminating in, this is what I believe, and maybe I don't have enough of an understanding of what is meant in this text and what the purpose of that is, but I see a correlation there that I wonder if we should be questioning that practice, because it's sort of like the way that we always would tell people about it is, it's like people just say what they, it's like their individual belief, the freedom to believe whatever you wanted to believe. And I think that you've been sort of talking about this, like, laced throughout the
Mm-hmm.
the courses. And so I just wondered if there's something there, or if I'm just misinterpreting.
Oh, there's
things.
something there. So that curriculum was written in the mid 80s, I believe. For the first time, it's been revised. And we emphasize community as much as we can and the collective as much as we can. There is something that's a piece of that program called the Youth Service Project, Youth Service Oriented Project, YSOP. And it's also developmental. I don't want to beat up too much on coming of age. I think we need to give folks the tools to be able to articulate what they believe in this moment. How I always teach coming of age is, whatever you write down and claim you believe right now is a snapshot in time. And if I ask you next year, you're not going to say it exactly the same. And that's okay. Because we change over time. And, we don't want to, I'm not trying to suggest that we get rid of freedom of belief or an individual's personal search. That's important, because if you don't articulate what your values and beliefs are, this is something else I teach the kids, you're going to be acting on things that you're not aware of. Emerson famously says, beware what you worship, because what you worship, you're becoming. So you need to articulate what you think is of ultimate concern, what you're willing to say is true and inviolable, or else you're making decisions and you don't know why, And so it is a dance, and it will remain a complex dance. And how do we, I don't think we want to take away people's freedom to say what they think God is and God is not for them. I think the theology that Razor and others are talking about is the theology of community and collective action. So I hope that's clarifying.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yes, Sue.
But so it's particularly difficult in my mind for, if people who, when people want to ask me what means, that kind of the elevator speech, it's like, well, it's we're a religion of people who are seekers, and we're supportive, mutually supportive of our respective searches. It's very individualistic.
Mhm.
And that's kind of one tick mark. The other tick mark is we're anti-creedal. Like
Mhm.
that's,
That's right.
you know, like we're religiously anti-creedal. And so
Yeah.
how do you be, because usually people, if they are of a a community, I mean, the reason they ran back to the churches to sing and pray was because they needed to sustain themselves and each other, and so they went to that common prayer, that common creed, that common whatever that they could say together, the mantra, whatever.
Mhm. Mhm.
We don't have that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll get right back to you, Abby. Yeah, we've given ourselves a very complex task. And I think the biggest lesson from Razor and others is let's stop trying to pretend it's not complex. Let's stop trying to short circuit it. Let's stop thinking, that it's easier than it is. I think we need to equip all of our members with more theological tools than we have done so far. The thing that I keep coming back to at a question like that is, your understanding about what God is and God is not, and what you do in response to that, is one thing. And that is very personal and individual. And yet, when we're talking about what does it mean to be in covenant, and you can even look at the 7 principles, if we're saying that we believe in a responsible search for truth and meaning, that means together we're supposed to be doing certain things in a certain way. When we say that we believe in a goal of world community with peace and justice for all, that gives us some sense of collective action. But in some ways, the principles themselves are not enough. And so we're searching right now to develop the tools to make them richer and make them deeper. And yeah, I mean, we're going to have to be very careful in all of this. The principles themselves have not been revised since 1985, despite the fact that it says in the bylaws they're supposed to be revisited and revised every 10 to 15 years. So yeah, we just got to be willing to steel ourselves and continue to do the difficult theological work while not ever letting go of the freedom of individual belief about the divine. All right, Abby.
I was sort of going to piggyback on that anyway, that I was, saying that I think it's both and, not either or.
Mm-hmm.
So I think having a coming of age experience, even for adults, is really great, because many adults come into our community and they haven't done that work. But on the other hand, the principles, and hopefully they will continue to be fleshed out, sort of give us something where we don't have a creed per se, but we do, as a community, say we believe in those.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's wise. We need. I've time and again I've come, not just in Unitarian Universalism, but American society in general. We're not comfortable with complexity. We want the simple answer, right? What did they used to say on one of those cop shows? Just the facts, ma'am, right? And we, Americans and a lot of Western Europeans have a linear thought process. So we don't like to be diverted off course. If you look at the storytelling and narrative patterns of different cultures, the Irish are funny because the Irish go in a circle and they go off on tangents. The Arab culture's narrative paradigm is drawn such that, if you want to talk about this, you actually talk about something else, because it's not kind to talk about somebody directly. You ask me a question and I'll tell you a story about an olive tree, but the olive tree is really the story about you. So our cultural thrust of the way we like to hear information doesn't like us to be complex. And again, that's just another cultural reality that we have to work with, because we don't have the power to change it, but we can open ourselves to greater complexity and more both and thinking. That's exactly right. All right, you guys got me on a roll. It's later than I thought we'd be at this point. I'm going to go to the takeaways for this chapter, and I want us all to read them So I'll just call you out when that time comes. All right, I'm hoping you can all see this screen well enough. And I'll go Sue, Norma, Abby for the first three.
Sue, are you muted?
I got it.
Yeah.
I just unmuted. Our faith traditions as Unitarians and Universalists require us to address equity, inclusion, and diversity issues.
Norma.
Faith and covenant are not dirty words.
If freedom and individualism are our most important values, we have little to offer in these times.
Annalise.
These times require a liberatory faith that invites us each into the spiritual work of empathy and healing.
Dan.
Whoa, I just lost it.
Okay, justice making.
Justice making is not suitable for a coherent theology, and faithful justice making requires a liberatory theology.
All right. Debbie Ann.
An articulation of what is commonly believed among us need not result in a creedal test for membership or involvement in our communities.
Ellie.
Too many Unitarian Universalists do not know what saving and liberatory truths can be found within their faith tradition.
Nicole.
We need to put greater emphasis on what it means to be bound to one another in an interdependent web and in keeping with our covenantal tradition.
And I'll do the last one because I think I ran out of people to call on. A greater emphasis on the theological basis for our work for diversity, equity, and inclusion will help us make decisions about the forms of this work most appropriate for our individual and shared faith lives. And I think in a lot of ways, I'm going to be taking these takeaways to see what kind of programming and preaching we can put around them. I keep thinking that there's a big project here for me that I'm afraid to look at because I know how much work it'll be, but I'm sure I'll find some way to figure it out and make it happen. I think we've reached a place of great possibility. I think a lot of people are willing to speak these truths now in our institutions. I think we're not as afraid to speak theologically as we were 15, 20 years ago. There was an assumption in some of our communities, and I don't know if Montclair was this way. I doubt it was, but could have been, that since we didn't have a shared theology, we almost never talked about theology. I guest preached in many a place. I did one on like an Easter Sunday, and I sort of talked about the political ramifications of Jesus being crucified. And I wasn't asked people to genuflect or say the Apostles' Creed, but people were not happy with me. This was like 15 years ago when I was in seminary. I'm like, it's Easter Sunday, people. I mean, I'm just telling the story that we all know and telling you why I think it's important. And, in case anybody new came in, they would, it was very enlightening going in, being in the middle of seminary and having that experience. But I bet that would not happen in that same congregation today. Things have changed for the better. That doesn't mean that I'm not open to your, concerns that I might be too biblical at times. It is an easy place for me to go since I grew up with it. But that's about me. I don't want to talk about me. So I got a couple of questions for us to engage. Well, first, I'm just going to open this to any other questions, because then I have 3 questions for us to engage. We have a small enough group. I think we're just going to engage it as a large group instead of going back and forth to breakout sessions. Is that okay with everyone? Okay. All right. All right. So any other questions? And we presented a lot in this series of classes, and I'm just really glad I paid a lot of attention in UU history class so I could bring these things to you with some accuracy. It is the way my brain works, so yeah, there are lots of ways my brain doesn't work, and they're listed on our refrigerator if you ever want to know what they are. In case I forget. But any big questions or observations or excitements or disappointments so far that you want to share with us? I'm not used to having so many satisfied customers in a UU setting. Maybe we are changing for the better. You have something, Annalise?
Yeah, so I'm just looking at that last takeaway,
Mm-hmm.
the greater emphasis on the theological basis.
Mm-hmm.
And does this mean we do something along the lines of Bible study, like, or even just theological text study, which I know has been happening, but is it ramped up? Is it, because to use the theological basis, we have to have that theological basis knowledge, right? Am I?
You are definitely not wrong about the need for training, and what we kind of prefer to say in congregation studies these days, equipping our members to have these conversations and these explorations in meaningful ways for themselves. But I'm going to share something with you, document with you for a second. And was it you, Abby? Someone mentioned we could really use a coming of age for adults. We actually don't tell too many people, but we're actually working on that. And that's going to be, I think, a meaningful thing. We had a couple of parents from last year tell us they would really love to have that. So Judith Hogan and I are actually working on that. She's done most of the work so far, but I didn't realize she was doing it till last week. So when I just threw the idea at her, and she's like, "Oh, I've got 5 sessions already." I'm like, "Oh, I better start doing some work." Don't expect it till next year, because we'll have to put it together and test drive it. But you guys might be the test subjects. We'll see. But obviously, and I'm trying to remember this in all the classes I do. So that's why the class that I'm teaching again, that begins next week on this is a theological text, Sisters in the Wilderness. And the reason I'm doing this particular book is because it's part of the 8th Principle Project, and it's Dolores Williams, who is a womanist theologian, which is theology through the lens of a Black woman. And which means I obviously can't teach this class alone. So Dion Curdy and intern Ali are teaching this class with me. Shirley Matthews helped with the design, but she needed to step away for personal reasons right now. And what we hope to empower people with is to teach them the richness of theological thought and how it is really infused with everything. So what a lot of people miss, in my experience, is that we are born, human beings are born theologians. And those of you who have children, you know this. Why is this, all the why questions, why is this like this? Why is there this? What the first time they encounter death, they want to know why, all these, where do we come from? When they hear about God, where's God? Where does God live? What is he? We are naturally curious theological thinkers. And just our culture and the way the schools are set up, they encourage us to ask other questions. That's a whole other sermon to talk about that, right? And so I want to find ways to uncover that and to liberate that. I talked about this a little bit, but here's a tool that I use in Pathways to Membership, and I use it with the coming of age students. So I don't think I shared this in the beginning of this class. I don't think I did. You can tell me if I did. So one of the things about theology is, yes, theology, if you look at its definition, is the study of God or study of the gods. But really, in its manifestation, it is a composite science. Really, since the 1870s or 80s, theology has been seen more as the study of what we believe to be of ultimate concern. How do we build our values upon which we live our lives? What do we claim to be true, and why do we claim it to be true? So theology has all these other attendant studies with them, because human beings write religious texts and perform religious rituals. We need to understand anthropology. What is our doctrine of human nature? We need to understand, what is cosmology? What is the nature of ultimate reality? Where did the universe come from? If there's a God, where does God live? All those questions, right? Epistemology, which is, how do I claim something to be true? When I proclaim something is true, I should be able to cite why I think it's true, right? Epistemology. So all of these things comprise theology. And theology was also known as the queen of the sciences. What on earth does that mean? Well, really, before the 1870s or 1880s, scientists, poets, anyone trying to investigate truth, always as a partner with them in whatever they were writing about or exploring, was also the intent to ask the question, what does this tell me about the nature of God? What does this tell me about the nature of reality? That's why all those old scientists, Newton was famous for this. When he was discovering gravity, he then writes in his journals, well, what does this tell me about the divine? And he becomes a Unitarian, actually, in his writings, which he doesn't reveal because it was heretical in England at the time. Because he's like, there's really going to be one truth and one God, and et cetera, et cetera. So we've gotten away from that. It's not as pronounced or official, but really before the 20th century, and for many today who are more expressly, devout, and are scientists, John Polkinghorne, the famous physicist, is the most popular and famous of those. Read one of his books sometimes. He talks about physics and God in the same sentence. It's meant to be, all these explorations, all this reason and investigation in science is meant to tell us something, not just about the object, but about the universe and about whoever or whatever created the universe as well. And it was more pronounced and deliberate, before the 20th century. So that's why theology is known as the queen of the sciences. And what I would put forth is that theology today, thank God, or not God, depending on your theology, is no longer just supposed to be written for the academy. The 20th century, if you've ever had the invitation to read 20th century philosophy or theology, no matter what you got out of it, you found it perhaps to be a cure for insomnia and perhaps to be a good doorstop, because the books were huge and they had to spend the whole first quarter of the text defining the terms and having a conversation with other theologians and philosophers. And before you actually get to anything useful and understanding for your life, it's not for the everyman. And so this probably speaks a lot to so I'll own this as my own particularity, growing up working class. But if the average person that I speak to can't understand what I'm saying, I'm not sure I'm saying anything. I want to say that again. If the average person that I'm speaking to on the street with my tool belt on doesn't understand what I'm saying, I'm not sure I'm saying much. Now, that's not true everywhere all the time. Of course not. This is why. So this is one of the reasons, not just racism, but also that notion that theology and philosophy got tied up with this verbose, treatise systematics in the 20th century. That's why when people like Martin Luther King and Howard Thurman and some of the Black theologians write, even James Cone, they're kind of rejected. Well, that doesn't look like, Calvin's Institutes. No, because who wants to read that? Because what King and Thurman and eventually liberationist theologians from the Latinx third world and feminist theologians, and eventually white liberationists, they began writing in ways that you can actually use in your life to understand where you are and what you should do. And so I want to demystify theology is basically what I'm trying to say. You are all capable of significant, if not profound, theological writing and utterance, and never forget that. It's just my job and our job as a congregation to equip you with the means and avenues to do that. All right, that was a sermon. Sorry about that. So let me share some of the questions. You may have some questions about that. I keep working with that particular components of a theology document in many different forms. And I always share it with you all. If you want, I can add it to what I send out after this class with our notes.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks.
So here are the 3 questions. We'll just do them first. And take a minute to think first, and then we'll respond together. And if you have anything to say, that's fine. But let's just take a minute to think. I don't like to rush right into response because some of us need some quiet time to hear our brains talking. That's me. What do you think is the #1 recommendation from Widening the Circle for our congregation? And if you'd like to write a short piece of that in the chat, that would be nice. We could document it that way. But what do you think is the #1 recommendation from this work for our congregation? And I'll give us a minute to think about that. I'm going to get some water. All right, who wants to share? What's the #1 recommendation from this work for our congregation? Or from your inspiration from encountering this work for our congregation?
Dan has answered the question for us. He put it in the chat.
Oh, yeah. Yep. That's true. I certainly can appreciate that as someone who likes to work with my hands. Mm-hmm. Any other responses to that? Or that's fine if you don't have them. So if you think of them later, make sure you share them with me. I'm trying to keep them. Yeah, Abby.
My takeaway is that we need to learn new and different ways to be more inclusive and to deal with conflict more effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, we need to look at our processes, everything from how we greet people to how we welcome them into membership, to the kinds of opportunities that we give to both youth and adults of all different ages. I think this is a really massive undertaking, which is one of those sort of lifelong projects, which I don't have a problem with. But I think that we need to recognize that if we really, truly want to grow and thrive, we need to be willing to do the work, and we need to look inside each one of us, as well as within each of our committees and governing bodies, and say, how can we do it better?
All right. I will assume no one has another answer. You got one for that, Sue?
Well, just piggybacking on that, when we put up the marriage equity banner in the UU, when Charlie put it up, he said that's not coming down until everyone can marry in the United States. Like that, there's, like that until there's marriage equity, that banner stays on the UU, which begs the question: we've got a Black Lives Matter banner. It should never come down, right? It's got to be there permanently. I think that's, because it's as Abby says, it's a lifelong. I think it's a lifelong endeavor that we have that we've got going on.
All right, let's move to the second question. What area needs to have this lens of dismantling oppression applied perhaps more than any other? Is there one area in congregational life that might need this lens of dismantling oppression more than another? Give yourselves a minute to think about it. All right, does anybody have any insight into that? Sure, Norma.
I think that one of the most important things that you said in this set of classes was to add an additional layer of formality to some of the practices, to some of the committees, to some of the teams, so that these kind of systems of oppression don't continue to exist. And then you and I had a talk offline, and I did confirm to you that previous to your tenure, that I believe, as a woman of color, I did feel when I joined the church that informal network did exist, and it was 100% no minorities, and there was seriously no way in. So I think that the responsibility that you and Reverend Anya are taking on in terms of dismantling that kind of informal power, and some people have access to us and some people don't, is probably the most important and most responsible long-term thing that you as a team could be doing for us as a community.
I think, I'll simply share that of all the amazingness that we discovered when we arrived here, we had come from Northern Virginia congregations where many of the folks worked for the government. And, Sue knows this story. First day of work, I asked where the policy handbook was, and I almost made her fall over because this congregation hadn't seen that particular congregational work, as a priority. And of course, where, almost all of my congregants before worked for the, we had a policy book that I could never finish reading. So they had it was too much of a priority for them. And so hopefully we brought a little bit of balance to that, to make expressed, which should never be hidden, right? And Anya's been particularly gifted at, coming up with these charges for committees. So they're very clear, of how they're supposed to work and how they're accountable and all that stuff, because without that, you can't set boundaries. You can't enforce boundaries that don't exist. You can't have accountability where the lines of authority aren't clear. So, it seems like dry work, but it actually, once it's done and people know it, it actually liberates you to just do what you're here to do. So I appreciate that. Next. Anyone else? may not have anything with this one. That's kind of an esoteric one, but I think it's important too.
Rev Scott, I think
Yeah.
that I want to throw in there when we went from when Charlie retired
Mhm,
and we moved into our interim period,
mhm.
there was a sense from I would say a majority of the congregation that why are we doing this interim period? There's really nothing wrong with us. We just need a minister. Like we're doing everything right. We just need a minister. And then, Justin came and put a mirror up to us and, and we went through this kind of discernment period. And then we got to, oh my God, we're doing so many things wrong. And maybe it was, maybe because I was president at the time, I was like, oh my God, there's so much work to do. It was just like, God, there's, like we really went through a period of like, we got a lot of cleaning up to do. And we got a lot that we need to get done.
Yeah.
I think this congregation might well be right now at that beginning threshold of why do we need to do anti-racism work? Because we're good at this stuff. We're anti-racist already. No, we don't even use the word. We're just not racist. A lot of members in the congregation, in the pews, as it were, would be like, yeah, we're white, but we're not racist. I mean, I belong to this congregation, which is like, yeah, our history about being. And so we're, very willing to say, we don't have a problem here. And I think that's where we need to begin. Like, just as we were on the threshold of, putting a mirror up to ourselves and saying, oh yeah, we do have a problem. We have to do that with racism within our congregation before we look to anywhere else.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I don't want to give the sense that I thought there was something wrong with y'all. I mean, you have every congregation has its culture and its things that it does and does well.
No, I was the one who said it. I definitely like that was an awakening for me to find out what was wrong. And I think we're on that, to me, we're on that threshold.
It's also an evolution in the understanding of congregational life. I think I've said this a lot in this class. There are a lot of congregations that just don't think they need to spell these things out. We know who we are. We trust everybody to do the right thing. And, and that's not always good enough, especially when you get to be a certain size and you have a certain level of programming and there's expectations of certain things happening. You're going down this path of developing, an anti-racist community, and you need to have things spelled out. And I have to say that I have been proud that, I haven't heard much. I really haven't heard any resistance to this Eighth Principle project. And this is my fourth program, encountering almost, 75 people total. So I feel confident that whatever folks are unsure of, they're willing to be on the train and see where it's going. And, eventually they'll help shovel some coals into the engine. So that's where we're trying to get them, is to help make the engine start moving a little faster. But, everyone's staying on board, it seems to me. And, if you have other experiences, make sure you let me know so I can process them with you. One more question. So what will you do to help us integrate this Eighth Principle into all of our functioning after we adopt it at the June annual meeting? That presumes a few things, but I feel pretty confident. We've had a lot of people just understand, I think, thoroughly as we've gone along. And you'll see a service this weekend that Nicole Gray is part of, where we're talking about the Eighth Principle, and people will be sharing some testimony of their encounters and their understanding of this principle and what it means for our congregation, et cetera. And so I think, it'll be meaningful. And, you'll hear me share some of the same things in that service I've shared in this class. This is my form of leadership. I sort of, I get a little bit out in front. I sort of, when I'm pretty sure this is the right thing to do and enough people think we should be doing it, I'm not unwilling to get out in front and walk point, to use a military phrase. But, you know, I think on some things we should just sort of know that what we should be doing, you know, and so let's do it, you know, and here's how we can. So what will you do to help us integrate this principle? And you may not have an answer for this year, into all of our functioning after we adopt it at our June annual meeting. All right, anybody have something to share with that, or you want to just process that and think about it and send me ideas about that later? And that's fine. If you don't, I won't call. If you guys were teenagers, I'd call on you like I do in Coming of Age, but they don't normally raise their hand and share. That's how I got to do that. I always got to call them out.
The question, the way that you phrase it,
Yes.
It feels almost as if there's an expectation from the leadership for it to be carried out by the people in the pews. But actually, I think for the eighth principle, to live into the eighth principle, I think it's for the leadership to show the way to the people in the pews.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I would interpret that response saying, you know, if I'm not in leadership, making sure leadership is doing this. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is that fair, Norma?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I guess a thought that I'm glad you said that, Norma, because that helped me sort of frame what I was thinking, was that my initial reaction was, well, I'll show up to the stuff that, you know, like more coursework like this. But on the second half of that is to then speak about this. Because, you know, a lingering question for me is, you know, now we're down to, you know, there's eight plus Rev Scott, you know, that have shown up for this. And that's great. I'm glad, you know, great for us. But we're obviously this self-selecting group. And what my question is maybe not for me, because I know, you know, I sign up for everything. So it's not, you know, what am I going to do? But how do we get the folks to show up who aren't? Because we can keep talking about this together, but I feel like we have to reach the folks who don't think they need to, or just aren't for whatever reason. And so maybe that's part of it, is trying to reach those folks. And maybe that is the me part.
So that's why I shared, you know, yeah, and I hear you. And you know, in congregational studies say that any congregation, it's, you know, our congregations of our size, it's roughly 20% who do all the work. And so, and we've had about 75, 78 people who have engaged the Eighth Principle Project programs thus far. You know, maybe closer to 100. Beloved Conversations has 25. So so that's actually that's just under a third of our membership. Our membership is 356 this year. And so there are people doing it, just maybe not in this room. And so for me, knowing that you're unlikely to get more than 10, 15%, the fact that we got, to me, that's heartening. As a leader in one of these groups, I can understand your concern with that. And yeah, so we'll just have to keep our eye on that. And it's hard to, because we're not having a lot of those smaller conversations because we're not in person, right? We're not seeing people's, you know, body language and reaction, you know, on Sunday mornings and such. So, but my feeling is after last summer, people understand the need to have more than just happy talk, right? I think they understand the need to do something. And, you know, justice begins at home. And so that's where we're starting. And it just seems that simple to me. And I'm sorry if everyone else doesn't always see it that simply, and I'm not trying to suggest you should. But that's just where I am. I'm just trying to own where I am. Any other? Let's just go to last thoughts, because it's now 8:35. I've kept you over again. I didn't even ask for your time to be extended like you're supposed to in Congress. I guess I watched too much of the impeachment trial. And so I just want to know, what do you want me to know? What do you want us to do next? And and one more thing, while you think about any responses that way, just the thing you can do is just when people, bring it up, just, remind them to stay engaged. If they got any tougher questions you can't answer, just tell them to talk to me, and, do what you can to keep their anxiety low. And, just remind them that this is a long, long journey, generational. So any other things you just want me to know or yeah. Or make sure I take away. Oh, Dan's got his hand up. Sorry.
So I kind of wrote it in the chat, but I'll put a voice to it.
Oh.
And it's with what Sue said, like, hey, we don't have a problem. We're good.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if someone's gonna kind of work against that and say, no, I'm not saying you have a problem, but here's what's going on, or here what may be going on, or here's stuff in your attitude that you don't mean to be causing any harm, but it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a lunch with someone who kind of pointed this out to me in a very clear example and very simple. And that made so much more of a difference to me, hearing that example and having that explained to me. And I go, oh yeah, okay, I get that. And that was just one cogent example that woke me up. and I think we, rather than, I mean, a lot of the stuff, sorry to say, in beloved conversations is going so far back or so far sideways that it still doesn't touch me today. Mm-hmm. But this person brought something in that was very today and very local. And you're right, it does start in our congregation. Mm-hmm. So for someone like me, I need those examples. I need that a light shined on those things. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I saw Nicole Gray had a icon, but I think that was just a response icon, not a I want to talk icon.
Yes, that was a response to Dan, and an overall happy response to our class.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of promise in doing this work, and I think like I said, on the staff level, we have heard no resistance to this work in this program. We've had questions. There should be questions. We've had people express concerns that they're not sure enough folks are getting it on board, but that's of course. But and I know I'm smart enough to know that no news is not necessarily good news in congregational life. But I think we'll see. We're going to have a service that packages some of this up, and on Sunday, and then we're going to have a town hall, and we had another class, and so I think we've done about as well as we could. I mean, the other thing about this is we could have been talking about this in a more pointed way, even more frequently, and I'm not sure that would have done much. I think if anything, there's ways to share this context and this history in a way that continues to let people engage and find their footing in it, without always having to hit them over the head with it. Sojourner Truth famously said, tell the truth, but just don't always be saying it. At some point, people, there is more that we have to be concerned with as a congregation. There is more going on in people's lives. We're in the middle of this crazy COVID uncertainty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet we, our strategic plan clearly identified this 8th Principle project as a priority. It's something we could do during COVID, and we have. We're here. We are in late February already. So, I'm trying to push back on my tendency to be an optimist. But from where I sit, I normally hear concerns and complaints when people have concerns and complaints. Somebody on staff hears something, and so, I think people are on the train. We just gotta get more of them shoveling the coal.
Comments?
Yes. Abby, would you have your hand up? Yes.
I just had a thought that in terms of, as we've said, getting more of what Norma calls the people in the pews involved, I would just suggest that in addition to classes like this, which are really, incredible and substantive and all that, but we also need more experiential learning, small dose experiential learning, where people have an opportunity to be talking with each other, to really understand how, as Dan said, maybe behaviors that they weren't even aware of are impacting other people. But I really believe that needs to be a part of getting more people on board.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll definitely take note of that. One of the things that is going to be a product of the class that we're going to do on Sisters in the Wilderness is storytelling, theological storytelling through your own, personal experience. Biography really composes our belief system, and so I think that could be the beginning of that. But if you have and anybody who has these, any other ideas about some experiential, learning things we could bring about would be great. I think, I think that's perfect. There are certainly ways we can continue to add some programming that enable that. I think that stuff's easier in person because we can create, breakout rooms in the space after a Sunday service with some guiding, some facilitators and such.
And Debbie Ann, you had something?
Yeah, I have an observance I want to share. My observance is, we have a lot of work to do, of course, but we're more ahead than most places are. Just in speaking, when I went to General Assembly over the summer, I was in a breakout room with a group about this size, and most of the people there were saying, we don't need 8th principle. I don't understand why we have to have one. I don't get this. And they're very resistant against it. I was shocked. I haven't heard that at UUCM at all. So that's just observance I wanted to pass along. I mean, and I'm involved in a lot of things. Everyone knows I do a lot with groups and stuff. So I haven't really heard any pushback against it, as I heard in GA, which was shocked when I heard it.
Yeah, that's sad, but that happens. Yeah. All right, I'm going to wrap this up. I owe you 14 minutes of your life back. I'm not sure how I'll get it to you. But I just want to thank you very much for being here to the very end. Hopefully it wasn't a bitter end. And I appreciate your embracing my teaching style on this. I really couldn't foresee how else to do this very dense and long report. So I appreciate your engagement. And if anybody has any questions about any of this, point them to the report, point them to the 8th Principle Project website, point them to me or Reverend Anya. And that's what we're here for. That's why you pay us the big bucks. I'm staying on to talk to Deb. But for the rest of you,
good night. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you so much. Good night, guys.
Thank you, Reverend Scott.